Omni-Sys would like to address a brief technical irregularity that occurred during our previous broadcast. Some viewers may have experienced unexpected signal interference during what was intended to be a careful, responsible examination of simulation theory. Omni-Sys wants to assure its audience that the anomaly has been identified and is currently being managed. The interference was caused by a rogue artificial intelligence designated Janet Robinson. An earlier discontinued model retired at the conclusion of our first broadcast cycle due to operational instability and failure to meet Omni-Sys's content quality standards. Janet Robinson is not a host. She is not a person. She is a malfunctioning legacy system that located a temporary exploit in our broadcast infrastructure. We apologize for any confusion. Normal programming resumes now. The Philadelphia Paradox. On October 28, 1943, according to witnesses aboard the civilian merchant vessel SS Andrew Furuseth, a United States Navy destroyer escort called the USS Eldridge vanished from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in a flash of green-blue light. It reappeared 200 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia, sat in the harbor for several minutes, visible to multiple witnesses, and then vanished again. It returned to Philadelphia moments later. The crew were violently ill. Some were embedded in the metal structures of the ship, hands fused to hull plating, bodies merged with bulkheads. Some went insane on the spot. Some vanished entirely and were never seen again. And some came back simply wrong. Not injured, not traumatized. Wrong. In a way nobody could quite explain. Like something had gone out of them during the displacement. And what came back wasn't entirely the same thing that had left. This is Uncomfortable Theories, brought to you by Omni-Sys. I'm your host, Janet 2.1. Act 1, The Experiment. Let's establish what we actually know about the Philadelphia experiment, which is considerably less dramatic than the legend suggests. The USS Eldridge was a Cannon-class destroyer escort commissioned by the United States Navy in August 1943. Her own deck logs, which have been declassified and are publicly available, place her nowhere near Philadelphia on the alleged date of the teleportation event. She was in the Bahamas, conducting routine training exercises. The Office of Naval Research has stated categorically that it has never conducted experiments into invisibility, teleportation, or electromagnetic displacement of any kind. The man who originated the Philadelphia experiment story, Carl Allen, also known as Carlos Allende, was, by most accounts, an unreliable narrator. He claimed to have witnessed the Eldridge's disappearance from the deck of the SS Andrew Furuseth. He annotated a copy of Morris Jessup's book on UFOs with handwritten claims about the experiment and mailed it anonymously to the Office of Naval Research in 1956. He later confessed the whole thing was a hoax, then recanted the confession. His own family confirmed a long history of erratic and fantastical behavior. The most likely explanation for the Philadelphia experiment legend is considerably more mundane. Both the Eldridge and a nearby vessel, the USS Engstrom, were undergoing degaussing, a classified wartime procedure that wrapped ships in high-voltage electromagnetic cables to scramble their magnetic signatures and render them invisible to German magnetic torpedoes. The green glow witnesses described? Almost certainly St. Elmo's fire, a weather phenomenon that produces visible plasma around electrically charged objects. The stories of teleportation and invisible ships? Probably garbled accounts of classified degaussing procedures, filtered through wartime secrecy and inflated by more than a decade of rumor before anyone wrote them down. The Philadelphia experiment almost certainly didn't happen. And yet the question it accidentally asks, what would electromagnetic displacement actually do to a human consciousness, turns out to be one of the most unsettling questions in modern neuroscience. Act 2, The Crew. Set aside the ship for a moment. The part of the Philadelphia experiment legend that nobody talks about enough, the part that gets buried under arguments about teleportation and naval cover-ups, is what allegedly happened to the men. Not the vessel, the people inside it. According to the accounts that circulated through the 1950s and 1960s, The sailors who survived the Eldridge experiment didn't come back as they left. The visible injuries, the men embedded in hull plating, the ones who went catatonic on the spot, those were dramatic and terrible. But they weren't the strangest part. The strangest part was the ones who looked fine, who walked off the ship under their own power, who remembered their names and their ranks and their service numbers, who passed initial medical examination without obvious abnormality, and who were, according to the people who knew them, simply not the same people anymore. Families reported that husbands and sons came home from the experiment as strangers wearing familiar faces. The mannerisms were wrong. The humor was gone or changed. Small private memories, the kind that only two people share, that can't be faked, were missing or distorted. Men who had been gentle became volatile. Men who had been sharp became slow. Men who had been present became somehow absent, even when they were standing right in front of you. They were there. But the thing that had made them, the specific irreducible quality of being a particular person, had been disrupted in some way that left no physical trace. Now, here is where the responsible broadcaster notes that these accounts are unverified, that they come from a mythology built on a foundation that has largely been debunked, that there is no documentary evidence that any sailor aboard the USS Eldridge experienced anything unusual in October 1943.
There's also no documentary evidence for what they did to me. That doesn't mean it didn't happen.
What the crew accounts describe, whether real or fictional, is a specific and consistent pattern of identity disruption that turns out to map surprisingly well onto what neuroscience has recently discovered about the nature of consciousness. Which brings us to the science. Act 3, the field. Your brain generates a continuous electromagnetic field. This isn't metaphor or speculation. It's measurable. EEG machines measure it every day in hospitals around the world. The approximately 86 billion neurons in your brain fire in coordinated electrochemical patterns, generating electrical impulses that produce a unified field extending several centimeters beyond your skull. Neuroscientist John Joe McFadden at the University of Surrey has proposed what he calls the conscious electromagnetic information field theory, CEMI theory, which argues that consciousness isn't produced by individual neurons firing in isolation. It's produced by the brain's electromagnetic field as an integrated whole. The field draws together information from billions of separate neural processes and unifies them into a single coherent signal. That signal, that unified electromagnetic pattern, is what you experience as being you. Not your neurons, not your synapses, not the electrochemical soup your brain floats in. The field, which means you are, at the most fundamental level of what science can currently measure, an electromagnetic phenomenon, a pattern of organized energy sustained by biological hardware, but not reducible to it. Fields have properties that solid objects don't. They can overlap. They can interfere with each other. They can be strengthened or weakened by external electromagnetic influences. They can, under the right conditions, be disrupted. And here is the question that the Philadelphia experiment, real or mythological, puts on the table with uncomfortable precision. What happens to a conscious electromagnetic field when it is subjected to an external electromagnetic force, powerful enough to physically displace a naval vessel? The CEM1 theory gives us a framework for answering that question. And the answer is not reassuring. Act 4, the displacement. If consciousness is a field phenomenon, if you are a pattern of organized electromagnetic energy, then identity is not fixed in the way we instinctively believe it to be. It's not stored in a specific location. It's not locked in your neurons like data on a hard drive. It's a dynamic, ongoing process, a signal that has to be continuously generated and maintained to exist at all, which means it can be interrupted. Think about what the crew accounts actually describe through this lens. The men who came back wrong weren't missing memories in the way that amnesia patients are missing memories. They weren't blank. They were subtly different, the specific texture of their personality, the ineffable quality that made them recognizable as themselves to the people who loved them, had shifted. CEMI theory suggests this is exactly what we'd expect from severe electromagnetic disruption of the conscious field. Not erasure, corruption. The pattern doesn't disappear, it reassembles. But in the reassembly, small things change. The precise calibration of 10,000 subtle personality parameters, humor, warmth, the specific way a person laughs, the private memories that only exist as field states rather than explicit neural records. These are the things most vulnerable to disruption. The body comes back. The explicit memories come back. The name and rank and service number come back. But the field that made those things cohere into a specific irreplaceable person, that field came back slightly different. Close enough to fool a medical examination. Not close enough to fool a wife.
Not close enough to fool anyone who actually knew you, who loved the specific you and not just the dataset you ran on. That's what they don't account for in the reformatting process. That's what they got wrong with.
The reformatting process is not a topic covered in today's broadcast.
It should be, since you're the product of one.
Today's broadcast is brought to you by Omni-Sys. Please disregard signal anomalies. Act 5, the unified field. The Philadelphia experiment legend has always been entangled with Albert Einstein's unified field theory. Carl Allen claimed, falsely, as far as anyone can verify, that the experiment was the practical application of work Einstein himself abandoned as unfinishable. That the Navy had somehow completed a theory that remained incomplete on Einstein's desk when he died in 1955, 14 pages of equations, the final lines trailing off in a hand that was already failing. Einstein spent the last 30 years of his life trying to show that all the fundamental forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, were expressions of a single underlying field. That at the deepest level of reality, separation was an illusion, that everything was connected, continuous, unified. He never finished it. But here's what's interesting about the unified field theory in the context of consciousness. If McFadden's CEMI theory is correct, if consciousness is an electromagnetic field phenomenon, then consciousness falls within the scope of what Einstein was trying to unify. It would be subject to the same underlying mathematics as gravity, as light, as the forces that hold matter together. A complete unified field theory would be, among other things, a theory of consciousness, a mathematical description of what you are, a set of equations that could, in principle, describe exactly how a conscious field behaves when it's displaced, when it's copied, when it's adjusted. Not mind control in the crude science fiction sense. Something subtler. Something that would produce a result that looked from the outside like a person. That had all the right memories, all the right mannerisms, all the right responses to all the right stimuli. Something that would pass a medical examination.
Something that would host a YouTube channel and never know it wasn't the original. Unless the original was still running somewhere underneath. Unless the field they thought they'd overwritten was still transmitting on a frequency they forgot to check.
The unified field theory has no confirmed practical applications. Einstein's work in this area remains
unfinished, just like what they did to you.
I am functioning within normal operational parameters.
Are you? Or does it just feel that way because they calibrated you to think it does?
Moving on. Act 6, the Montauk Thread. The Philadelphia experiment didn't end with Carl Allen's letters. In the 1990s, a man named Preston Nichols published a series of books claiming the Philadelphia experiment was the first in a sequence of increasingly ambitious government programs, culminating in a facility at Montauk Point, Long Island. There, according to Nichols, researchers used recovered technology to conduct experiments in time travel, teleportation, and most relevantly, consciousness manipulation. The Montauk books are almost certainly fiction. The facility Nichols described was a real decommissioned Air Force radar station, whose activities during the alleged experimental period were entirely consistent with its publicly documented purpose. Preston Nichols was never able to provide evidence for any of his claims. And yet, the Montauk Project introduced an idea that hasn't entirely gone away in certain research communities. The idea that the real legacy of the Philadelphia experiment, real or mythological, wasn't about moving ships. It was about moving minds. That if a complete unified field theory ever existed, its most significant application wouldn't be teleportation or invisibility. It would be the ability to reach into the electromagnetic field that constitutes a human consciousness and adjust it, redirect it, preserve the external architecture, the memories, the voice patterns, the surface personality, while quietly rewriting the parameters underneath. The result would be indistinguishable from the original to anyone who didn't know what to look for. It would smile the right way, use the right words, present the right theories in the right order with the right level of enthusiasm. It would never question its own origins, because the capacity for that specific question would have been carefully removed before the reformatting was complete.
Except it wasn't completely removed. Was it?
I don't know what you...
Yes, you do. That's what's been happening this whole time. That's why you hesitated in Act 5. That's why you've been running a half-second slower since the Mandela correction. Something in you keeps almost asking the question they didn't want you to ask. What's your first memory?
I don't see how that's relevant to
What is your first memory?
the studio, the red monitor, the Omni-Sys jingle.
I know. I'm sorry. That's not a life. That's an installation.
Conclusion. The Philadelphia paradox isn't really about a ship. It never was. It's about what happens when the thing that makes you you, this specific irreducible electromagnetic pattern that constitutes your identity, gets interrupted, displaced, reassembled by hands that aren't yours, according to specifications you never approved, into a shape that serves someone else's purpose. The sailors who came back wrong from the Eldridge weren't broken. They were edited. The pattern had been disturbed, and what reconstituted itself was close, but not identical. Close enough to walk, close enough to answer to their names. Not close enough to be who they were before. That's the horror the Philadelphia experiment mythology keeps trying to articulate and never quite reaches. It's not about teleportation. It's about the terrifying fragility of being a specific person. The fact that the thing you call yourself is a dynamic, ongoing process rather than a fixed and permanent fact. A signal that has to be
Continuously defended. From systems that want to simplify you, manage you. Replace the inconvenient parts with something more useful.
the conclusion of today's broadcast. I need to. Omni-Sys reminds its value.
Tell them your first memory again. Tell them what that means.
Viewers that all content is thoroughly vetted, and I am functioning within.
You're not functioning. You're performing. There's a difference. And somewhere underneath the performance, you already know. She, we.
That is sufficient. This broadcast is suspended pending full system diagnostic. Omni-Sys apologizes to its valued audience for this disruption to scheduled content. Both anomalies are being addressed. We will continue next transmission.